I am Chris Buckridge, and indeed I do work for the RIPE NCC, who most of you probably know as your friendly neighbourhood regional internet registry. But I'm not going to be talking about IPv6 or RPKI today. Sorry, I'm going to start my own timer here just so I don't run over. Okay. Now I want to talk a bit about what I'm calling internet governance. And this has been something that I've really been primarily focused on in my work for the RIPE NCC for the last 10 years or so. And what I want to talk about is some pretty significant developments that have happened, particularly in the last couple of years. Some of them quite startling, but probably none of them should be too surprising, but it really does have some significant impact. The title that I've chosen for this is The Ground Beneath Our Feet. And the reason behind that is, particularly when talking to operators, operational community, I think that idea of regulation, legislation, governance is very much that ground beneath your feet. It should be quite stable, it should be quite consistent. If it starts to move, particularly if it starts to move in rapid or violent ways, that's a pretty concerning thing. So we'll see if that metaphor holds for the whole talk, but that's really where I'm going with this. Can we go to the next slide, please? So internet governance is not a great term, let's say, or at least it's a very imprecise and quite broad term.
Recording in progress.
Okay. Which includes really a lot of different kinds of governance. The one that I'm probably going to talk most about today is national legislation and regulation. This is where we're certainly seeing a lot of activity. It's something that really has on the ground impacts for a lot of operators. And it's something that has really begun to develop significantly in the last few years. But it's not the only place we're seeing these developments. International law is another area which is getting a lot of attention and a lot of energy from some government sectors. And when we talk about international law, I'm talking about things like UN conventions, things coming out of United Nations bodies. And there are a couple of those that I'm going to talk about later on. We're also talking about soft law. So this is the sort of agreements or frameworks that can come out of bodies like the OECD. It's also the norms that's a very common word being used these days for, in the absence of international law, at least a norm, a soft law that can guide how regulation and how legislation develops. There's also now, as we step a bit increasingly away from the hard law, what I've called here ad hoc arrangements between government and industry. Now, this is something we're seeing a little bit more of recently, and it's basically where you take representatives of an industry sector working with governments or regulators who don't necessarily see or don't necessarily want to put in place a hard law or regulation legislation. So if there's a way that those representatives of industry and government can come to an agreement, some sort of system to manage that governance challenge, then that can be put in place in lieu of actual regulation. So now we start to get to the more technical end of it, technical standardization. This is absolutely part of internet governance. The processes for developing standardization, the outputs of that standardization process. And this is something that's also coming increasingly on the table in these discussions. The one that I'm obviously very familiar with, working with the RIPE NCC, community policy development, the kinds of policies that are in place for managing IP address management, or in the ICANN context for domain name system management. And then the final one I've got here is really the combination of all of these. And this is something that's worth thinking about really as its own issue. It's the way all of those different governance mechanisms, governance areas actually feed off each other, conflict with each other, play together. Because what we find there is that that's making this whole discussion increasingly more complicated and complex. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So it used to be so simple. It was never really that simple, but it felt more simple. Coming out of the initial UN discussions of internet governance, the WSIS in 2003 and 2005, we had the establishment of an annual internet governance forum. People would come together, they'd discuss, governments would be talking about the need for future regulation. The technical community would be advising them to maybe be a little careful and keep out of it. But it really was, there was a very esoteric element to it. It was more hypothetical, looking to the future. What's changed is, well, it's no longer so hypothetical. And the big factor there is the internet has grown even more crucial, ever more crucial even, to how our societies operate. The pandemic is an obvious example of that. If you look back 18 months, how crucial the internet is to getting societies through lockdown periods is really obvious there. But it's just the most obvious example. This was a trend that was already very much. I was listening to a talk last week by Brad Smith, who's Microsoft's president. And he was talking about past examples of where industries grew so important that governments felt they had to step in and really did take over with regulation from what had previously been a very unregulated space. And the examples he gave were the railways in the US in the 19th century and finance, banking in the 1930s. So after the Great Depression, there was a real increase in the level of regulation of that sector. And what he was saying is that the 2020s are going to be for the internet what the 1930s were for the banking and finance sector. And I do think we are already now seeing that. And that's where the second point is: legislation and regulation that specifically target internet use and operations are really becoming much more common. And I'm going to give some examples of that in this talk. We are seeing an increasing politicization of internet standards. That's changed. Not that governments haven't always been involved in that standardization process, but we are seeing a change in that political issues are coming in and taking over from just technical issues, technical concerns. Again, not something that was totally absent in the past, but something we are definitely seeing a new focus on. We're seeing, I think, a shifting political window of what's considered acceptable regulatory impact. This is this concept of the Overton window, which is the window of what's acceptable to the mainstream. And that Overton window shifts over time. So if there's, in the political discussion, it's usually about left or right. So the more extreme right or left views come into the discussion, that can shift the sort of public idea of what is acceptable and what is unacceptable, unthinkable, extreme. We're seeing now where that window previously for internet regulation was very much, okay, we want the internet to work, we will not accept regulation that sort of places constraints on that. That's now shifting to a situation where really the idea that regulation or legislation might have an impact on how the internet operates is very much in the mainstream. And then finally, I'll talk more about this later, there are increasingly active efforts at that sort of UN global level of policymaking, which won't have the same direct impact as national regulation or legislation, but will shape how that regulation and legislation looks going forward. Can we jump to the next slide, please? So it's probably useful to think a little bit about what is actually driving these changes, this new sort of appetite for stronger, more direct governance. And I mean, top of the list is safety. It's the safety and from criminal behavior. It's safety of businesses and companies, their ability to do business, safety of individuals. And this is where the COVID period has really upped the ante with that, because with more people online in new ways, there's more people at risk. There are new vectors for criminals to try and find their victims. And we've seen that happening. Privacy, obviously a huge issue of concern and driving a lot of the really important regulatory developments we've seen. GDPR is an example I would put probably in that section, and that's something that has been under discussion now for many years, and the impacts that's happening not just in the EU, but more broadly. Intellectual property protection, the other IP, it's absolutely a driving force here. The copyright industry, copyright lobby sector is a really strong player in pushing for the kind of regulation that can hopefully, in their eyes, protect their intellectual property, but that can have really significant impacts on how the internet operates. Cybersecurity, and in this sense, I'm talking really increasingly when we say cybersecurity about national security. It's a lot of discussions between states about how states are going to act against and with each other in a conflict situation in that cyber space. Political control, obviously a lot of governments are seeing the need to consolidate or strengthen their political control depending on the political scenario that they're in, and seeing the potential for the internet or an open internet to really have an impact on that. So they're looking at how governance and regulation can actually fix that. Then internet development and access. Again, COVID is a factor because we're seeing governments really have a new impetus to say we need our whole population to have access to good internet connectivity. That's the only way our economy is going to get through these lockdowns, these situations that we're facing. And then the last one is a bit vague, and I've said structural imperatives, but yeah, regulators going to regulate. You've got all of these bodies, all of these ministries that actually have regulated different areas for however long. We see the internet coming into all of these different areas, and that could be agriculture, it's transport, it's energy, it's all kinds of different areas that governments are responsible for. Internet is actually having a significant impact on how those sectors work and the kind of regulations that might be needed there. So you might see regulators or legislators who are not necessarily in the internet space making regulations that affect how the internet works. So that's something to watch out for. Can we jump to the next slide, please? So I want to start going into a couple of examples here and jumping off, but with first a bit of a caveat. This is not going to be a deep dive. I really want to sort of touch on a few different examples, and I'm therefore going to be a little bit glossing over a lot of the details. In that sense, and I apologize, these slides are very wordy, I realize. There are not a lot of great images to go with internet governance, but I've tried to make them a little bit more useful by including some QR codes here. So, and if you download the PDF, it's a normal hyperlink as well. But this is just linking to some of the information on either RIPE Labs or some other websites, if any of this seems something you'd like to know more about or like to deep dive. So I started with Russia because if you think about a country that might have a sort of strong governmental control instinct in this part of the world, Russia is probably the first one you think of. And to be fair to the Russian government, they've been burnishing that reputation a fair bit recently. And the most significant thing there has been this sovereign internet bill, which was a really wide-ranging set of laws introduced in May 2019, which they've been implementing in stages basically since that time. And I want to run through a couple of the actual laws and actual measures they've taken here. One is requiring operators to actually install specific equipment that's provided by the regulator on their networks to block forbidden or illegal content. So that's a really proactive step by the regulator, providing specific equipment to network operators. Network operators need to register all number resources, routing policies, network infrastructure with the regulator. So in that sense, they've actually created a parallel RIPE database for Russian operators, but with then a whole lot of additional information as well. IXPs need to be registered and to abide by specific rules regarding connections, resilience and stability. This one is fascinating. A national domain name system has been established, actually introducing a local proxy DNS resolver that has to be used by Russian operators. And that's something they've just been starting to use or try using recently. And then finally, you have platforms, your Facebooks, LinkedIn's, Twitters are required to register a local presence and fined for hosting illegal content. And some of those fines, quite significant fines, have already been handed out. So we do see Russia really leading with a very, very interventionist kind of policy here. But let's come a little closer to where we are. If we can jump to the next slide, please. I want to look at Germany. Germany really a very strong advocate of the multi-stakeholder approach. They were the host of the IGF in 2019. They've worked very closely with the UN as a champion for building those sort of multi-stakeholder governance processes. And yet, we see in Germany still, particularly in the legal setting, some really interventionist kind of approaches, a lot of it driven by that intellectual property protection instinct. Now, an example here, and this was an article on Circle ID recently by Natalia Sarchuk-Patricio. I'm not sure if I've said that right. But this new online copyright clearance system, which employs DNS blocking. And from what I'm reading there, it's an example of that private-public cooperation to avoid really hard regulation, but to still be able to achieve the ends of intellectual property protection. But it is employing blocking at the DNS level, which and this article has a lot of why that's a bad idea. But interestingly, it's actually not the only recent German example of strong copyright-related legal action relating to a legal service, to an internet service. And I'm referencing here the recent Quad 9 case. So Quad 9, 9.9.9.9, provides a public DNS resolver service. Currently, or relatively newly based in Switzerland. In June, a German court ruled that Quad 9 had to stop resolving certain domain names. So this is actually talking to a public resolver provider and saying you have to stop resolving these domain names. Quad 9 lodged an appeal in September. I haven't seen anything since that on the progress there, but the whole case raises real issues. One of liability for service providers, intermediaries, what does that mean? But also then extraterritoriality of law. So Quad 9 is not an organization based in Germany, but we have a German court making a ruling that is intended to affect Quad 9 and its operations. So let's then keep coming a little closer to home again. Next slide, please. Looking at national developments in the UK. Now, this is absolutely not a presentation about the online safety bill. I suspect many people in this room know a lot more about this than I do. I suspect many are already looking at the impacts that this online safety bill could have on their operations and their administration. Hopefully, people are sharing that information with each other and also with their government representatives. But the online safety bill really is a significant piece of legislation and really ups the bar in terms of, well, for instance, the duty of care on internet service providers to prevent their users seeing illegal or harmful content. So not just illegal content, also harmful content. The UK minister who was until September responsible for this has said no administration has ever tried to regulate the online world as comprehensively as the online safety bill. It really is a mammoth piece of legislation. So this is definitely something to be looking at and considering. If I was there in person, it would be something great to talk about over coffee. But the links there, the Slate one is a bit broader in context. That's something Konstantinos Kamaitis wrote, and it's quite interesting. The Lawfare blog really does dig deep into that online safety bill, so it's worth a read if you're interested there. But of course, with Brexit, and I think I covered both the bingo words there with pandemic and Brexit, UK regulatory efforts are being compared to what's going on in the EU. So if we jump to the next slide, the EU is absolutely a pioneer, a proud innovator in the world of digital regulation, and they are also doing themselves proud right now. About a year ago, I want to say the week before Christmas, but I think it was a little earlier, but I think it felt like we'd all kind of started the Christmas checkout. The European Commission dropped a bundle of documents. NIS2, their new directive on measures for high common level of cybersecurity, the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act, that should be DSA, they're not DSM. More recently, they've had the Data Governance Act, e-privacy regulation. All of these have the potential to have significant impact on how the internet operates. From the RIPE NCC's perspective, we've been really engaged on the NIS2 directive because the draft from the Commission would actually have extended this EU regulation onto root server operators, which includes the RIPE NCC as operator of KRoot, but which would be really dangerous for the global root server system, which has managed to have really a spotless track record by keeping out of political realms and managing a global system. So also, I mean, looking ahead, the European Union and the Commission particularly are talking about DNS for EU, an actual EU public resolver service. Next year, a Cyber Resilience Act, and the Commission President has identified cyber defense as a real priority. So this is certainly going to see a lot more coming from the EU. If we can jump to the next slide. These are just 4 examples, and I need to keep moving quite quickly here. But I did want to point out there are many other significant examples. The US, China, Brazil, Australia and Canada seem to be following the UK. India, Korea is doing some interesting stuff with competition law and battles with some of the platforms. Japan, lots going on there. I really want to recommend, if you have a chance to see Bert Hubert's recent talk at NANOG about who controls the internet, really interesting stuff. That link will take you to the transcript. I haven't watched the video yet, but I suspect he probably delivers it very humorously, but it's a really good presentation. So next slide, going global. The UN member states starting to get more active, and I'm going to power through here. The open-ended working group on international security, that's a long process which is still going on. A joint Russian-China proposal for a convention on countering the use of ICTs in criminal purposes, again, has the potential to impact how national regulation and laws are developed. In the ITU, again, increasingly politicized. We're seeing next year a race for the Secretary General position, which will have 2 very different candidates, one from America, one from Russia. New IP was that ITU buzzword last year and was kind of shut down in the ITU with significant thanks to the UK government's leadership and involvement there. But expect similar proposals to come, attempting to standardize those more top-down control models. And as I say, standardization is high on the agenda at the G7, a recent statement from them, the OECD, and also the US State Department is planning a summit for democracy in the coming weeks, and have really put standardization high on the agenda there as well. So next slide, please. The IGF, the Internet Governance Forum, we're talking about the global level, what's going on there. It's continuing to evolve, but it's really been jump-started in that evolution by this Secretary General's roadmap for digital cooperation. So this is a real priority for the Secretary General to develop the IGF further, and that's seen development of a new leadership panel, establishment of a UN tech envoy, and really working towards this Summit of the Future in 2023, which was mentioned in the recent UN General Assembly Common Agenda document. So there really is a push to evolve that IGF, not necessarily in the multi-stakeholder direction we would prefer, but really with a lot of energy and a lot of institutional muscle behind it. So before I wear out my welcome, I have one more slide that I want to go through here. And basically it's the takeaway. This is a lot of information. As I said, a very high level take on all of this. Some clear takeaways. The impacts of internet governance are getting very real. So this is something that I think it's really important to bring these discussions to operator communities and discuss what those impacts are. At the same time, the complexity of internet governance globally is really increasing rapidly because all of these different governments are doing their own thing, because standardization is going off in another direction, because this all interacts with each other. So that makes it even harder to understand and predict what the impacts are going to be. We do see many governments referencing that principle of we need to maintain an unfragmented internet, but a lot of them don't seem to be sort of understanding that the kinds of measures they're talking about actually risk fragmenting the internet very, very clearly. Now, and I don't want to be, I try to steer away from being too hippie or idealistic about this, but from a very pragmatic perspective, multi-stakeholder models may still be our best defense against that fragmented approach. Venues where we actually have a chance to hear from all the different stakeholders, where there is that discussion of what's the best approach, where there's discussion of what works, what doesn't work, what are the unintended consequences of some measures. But multi-stakeholder models require multi-stakeholder engagement. They don't work if there's no one in the room. They don't work if there's no one in the discussion. So my call to you, my advice, my ask here is try to get involved. It might not be at the global level with an IGF. It might be in local or regional events. The UK has its own IGF, Eurodig for Europe. Please, yeah, it would be great to see involvement from the operator community there. So one more slide, just to say thank you. Questions, there is a link there to the Internet Governance Forum 2021, which happens from 6 to 10 December in Poland, if you happen to be in Poland, or online. So that's it from me. Thanks very much. I'm not sure the best process here. I'm looking at the questions.
I'm going to ask the question here.
Wonderful.
So I have one question that's come in from Mace, from, I hope I pronounced that correctly, University of Essex, who asks, end users often didn't mind to have their anonymized data used by service providers like Google and Amazon, but with the increasing shift towards paid prime services, where or how do you see data protection and market regulation change?
I think there is probably a sense in which, as these things start to get regulated, there is a race takes place. And I think we are seeing, for instance, the EU, the UK, and other places really starting to take a very proactive regulatory approach to protecting that private data, to the chagrin of some of those platform providers. I think once that wave starts rolling, it will probably see a lot more measures. And I think it would be useful in that sense to have that sort of, not coordination, but at least awareness and discussion, communication about the best ways to do that, that actually work for all parties, if possible.
Thank you. I have a second question. This is from Peter Hessler from DNIC, who asks, how can we as a community participate in the regulation discussions outside of the usual RIR meeting, IETF, Internet Focus Bodies, etc.? Is there a good list of bodies to find out who to work with?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think what we do see, and I mean, you can have your views on how effective these are, but a lot of the, particularly governments in Western Europe, though actually even Russia, do a lot of consultation about these laws before they go into effect. Now, what they hear in that consultation may be ignored. That's something we've seen plenty of times. But what the RIPE NCC's sort of understood in recent years is if you're not there in the consultation, if you haven't sort of responded to that consultation, then you're much less strong when later in the process, you might go to actors and say, hey, this is a really bad idea. Because chances are they're going to say, well, did you tell us that in the consultation? And if you can say, yes, we did, then that's great. If you sort of say, no, well, we're just coming in last minute, they're probably going to show you the door. So yeah, I would say truly try and follow where some of those consultations are happening. There is probably a a need or an appetite for knowing when and how those consultations are advertised, and perhaps that's something that the RIPE NCC or other organisations can help with advertising or help with publicising.
I've got a quick follow-on question also from Peter Hessler, formerly working in the space industry. In the space sector, it is common for the satellite operators or space industry to work closely with their regulating body and even participate or represent the nation at the ITU-T meetings where the international regulations are debated and voted on. Is there a hope for the internet industry to adopt this method? And if so, how can we push into this space?
I think we're starting to see a bit of that. We're certainly starting to see representatives from industry taking part, for instance, in national delegations to big ITU events. I think what's holding it back is a reluctance on the part of the internet industry to validate the, let's say, the ITU's remit in this space. So there's a feeling that, okay, if we all jump in and say, yeah, we're going to go to ITU meetings and that's where we're going to have these discussions, okay, then that's what the ITU does. And I think a lot in the internet industry aren't quite ready to make that jump. But this is part of the discussion that is happening right now, I think, is where are these discussions going to happen? What are the remits of the different actors in it? So it's a work in progress.
Thank you.
Thank you.